The city of Detroit lay beneath a heavy blanket of darkness, the distant hum of traffic the only sign of life in the sleeping metropolis. The outskirts, however, told a different story. Beyond the dimly lit streets and forgotten alleyways, the land stretched into a vast wasteland of decay, a landfill so immense it seemed to swallow everything that entered. Piles of rotting waste towered like grotesque monuments to abandonment, the air thick with the acrid stench of decomposition. Torn plastic bags fluttered in the wind, caught on rusted metal scraps, and rats darted between the wreckage, their tiny claws scratching against shattered glass and broken wood. Somewhere within this desolate graveyard of discarded things, a sound pierced the suffocating silence. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper against the howling wind. But then, another, and another, a weak, trembling chorus of cries, small, desperate, fading. Not an animal. No, this was something else. Martha Jenkins trudged forward, her frail body wrapped in layers of rags that barely shielded her from the biting cold. She had lived on the streets for so long that she no longer felt the chill the same way others did. It was simply there, an old enemy she had long since stopped fighting. Her body ached with every step. Age and hardship had stolen her strength, leaving her movements slow and uncertain. The old wooden cane she leaned on sank slightly with each step into the damp, uneven earth. She exhaled sharply, her breath a visible cloud against the night air. She had wandered into the landfill in search of anything useful, something to trade, something to eat. But now she stood frozen, listening. The cries again. She turned her head sharply, her tired eyes scanning the landscape of garbage, searching for the source. The sound was coming from somewhere close, hidden within the mountains of waste. Her heart pounded as she moved faster, her cane dragging against the ground as she navigated the unstable terrain. Then, beneath the dim glow of the distant city lights, she saw it. A pile of black garbage bags, torn and spilling their contents onto the ground. Among them, half buried in filth, 3 tiny figures. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, afraid of what she might find. But then one of them moved, a tiny arm jerking slightly, a fragile body shuddering against the cold. Her knees buckled, and she dropped down beside them. 3 newborns. Their faces were red from crying, their lips quivering as they gasped for breath. Their fragile bodies, bare, exposed, lay against the filth, their tiny hands curled into fists, their skin already taking on a sickly pallor from the freezing air. Someone had left them here to die. No blankets, no protection, nothing but the cruel embrace of the night and the deafening silence of a world that had chosen to ignore them. Martha reached out with trembling fingers. "Oh, dear Lord," she whispered, her voice breaking. She couldn't comprehend it. The cruelty of it. How could someone, anyone, do this? Her entire body ached with sorrow as she carefully lifted the first baby into her arms, cradling the small, shivering form against her chest. The infant let out a weak cry, but it was fading fast. The cold was draining their strength, stealing their fragile little lives with every passing second. The second child trembled as she gently scooped him up, pressing his tiny body close to her. His breathing was uneven, his little fingers barely moving. The third was the weakest of all. Martha's heart clenched. If she had come even an hour later. No, she couldn't think about that. She had found them. They were alive, and she would not let them die. She swallowed hard and removed her tattered scarf, wrapping it around the smallest baby. It was barely enough to offer warmth, but it was all she had. She pressed the infants close to her body, trying to share what little heat she had left in her old, weary bones. "You poor little things," she choked out. "Who could do this to you?" The babies did not answer. They only whimpered, exhausted, fighting for the warmth they had been denied. Martha forced herself to her feet, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. She was weak. She was old. But these children needed her, and if the world had abandoned them, then she would not. She looked around, her mind racing. No one was coming for them. No one cared. The streets of Detroit had no mercy for the forgotten, and these babies had already been thrown away once. If she left them, they would not survive the night. Her fingers tightened around them, holding them close, as she took a slow, shuddering breath. She had nothing. No home, no food, no certainty of what tomorrow would bring. But she had them now, and that was enough. With slow, unsteady steps, Martha Jenkins turned her back on the landfill and disappeared into the shadows of the city, carrying 3 tiny lives in her arms. She didn't know what would happen next, but she did know one thing. She would fight for them, no matter what. If you like interesting stories, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. And let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. Martha Jenkins had lived a hard life, but nothing compared to what lay ahead. With 3 newborns wrapped in layers of rags and her own frail body weakening by the hour, every step she took felt like a battle. The streets of Detroit were ruthless, and Martha knew that kindness was rare. No one would offer shelter to an old homeless woman, let alone one carrying 3 crying infants. The first night was the worst. She found a narrow alleyway between 2 abandoned buildings, the walls crumbling, graffiti covered, and damp with the stink of urine. It was no place for children, but she had no choice. The city shelters were overflowing, and those who ran them turned away people like her, people who had been on the streets too long, people they had stopped seeing as human. She sat down slowly, wincing as her aching bones met the cold, hard pavement. Pulling the babies close, she shielded them with her tattered coat, whispering soft words of comfort they were too young to understand. Their tiny bodies shivered against her. Her arms tightened around them. "You're safe, little ones," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I promise you. You're safe with me." But as the wind howled through the alley, slicing through the layers of rags, Martha felt the weight of reality crushing her chest. How would she feed them? How would she keep them warm? She didn't sleep that night. She simply held them, rocking them gently, willing her body to stay strong. By dawn, the hunger had already begun gnawing at her stomach. The babies whimpered, their cries hoarse from exhaustion. She knew what they needed. Milk. Food. Something she didn't have. Dragging herself to her feet, she stepped back onto the streets, clutching the babies close to her chest. Detroit was waking up, the sidewalks filling with hurried footsteps and the distant honking of impatient drivers. People passed by her without a glance. She had long since become invisible to them. Her first stop was a small grocery store. She hesitated at the entrance, gripping the doorframe for support. The warmth inside was inviting, and the scent of fresh bread made her stomach twist painfully. But she wasn't here for herself. She approached the cashier, an older man with deep frown lines etched into his face. He barely looked up from counting his register. "Sir, please," she rasped. "I need something for them. Just a little milk, or formula. Anything." The man's eyes flicked toward the babies, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might help. Then, without a word, he pointed to the door. Her heart sank. "Please," she tried again, her voice shaking. "They'll die if—" "Not my problem," he muttered, slamming the register shut. She stared at him for a long moment, disbelief and helplessness twisting inside her. Then, slowly, she turned and left, her steps heavier than before. She wasn't sure how long she walked after that. Hours, maybe. The babies grew quieter, too quiet. It terrified her. She knew they were growing weak. She had to find something. Then, just as she was about to collapse from exhaustion, she saw her. Donna. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted from a small, weathered bakery on the corner. And standing outside, dusting flour from her apron, was a woman Martha had met before. A rare soul who, on occasion, offered kindness where no one else would. Martha's lips parted, a sob of relief catching in her throat. With the last of her strength, she stepped forward. Donna looked up, and for a moment her face hardened, just like everyone else's. But then, her gaze dropped to the babies, and something in her softened. "Martha," she murmured, stepping closer. Martha couldn't hold back the tears anymore. "I need help," she choked out. "Please." Donna hesitated only a second before opening the bakery door. "Come inside," she said softly. The warmth hit Martha like a wave as she stepped in, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Donna quickly pulled out a chair, guiding her down. Without a word, she disappeared into the back, returning moments later with a warm bottle of milk. Martha didn't waste a second. She took the bottle with shaking hands and gently pressed it to the lips of the smallest baby. He latched on weakly, his tiny mouth sucking desperately. Tears streamed down her face as she watched him drink. Donna sat across from her, studying her carefully. "You can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "Those babies need more than you can give them." Martha flinched. "I won't leave them," she whispered fiercely. Donna sighed, rubbing her temples. "You should at least go to a shelter, somewhere warmer than the streets." "They won't take me," Martha said, shaking her head. "Not with them." The silence between them was thick, heavy. Donna knew she was right. Finally, Donna stood. She grabbed a small loaf of bread, wrapped it in parchment paper, and handed it to Martha. "It's not much," she said, "but it's something." Martha swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. Donna nodded, her face unreadable. As Martha left the bakery, the bread tucked beneath her arm and the babies nestled safely in her coat, she knew one thing. She had won today's battle. But tomorrow would be another fight for survival, and she had no idea if she would win. The days turned into weeks, and Martha Jenkins fought harder than she ever had before. Caring for 3 infants on the unforgiving streets of Detroit was a battle against hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Every night, she wrapped them tightly against her body, shielding them from the freezing winds, whispering lullabies into their tiny ears as they clung to her warmth. She scavenged for food, sometimes going days without eating so that the babies could have what little she could find. The city was merciless. The stares from strangers were either indifferent or full of disdain. People stepped around her like she was part of the filth beneath their feet. Others muttered insults under their breath. She had grown used to it over the years, but now, with 3 fragile lives depending on her, the cruelty cut deeper. She named them Elijah, Michael, and Grace. Elijah was the strongest, the loudest. Even as a baby, he demanded more food, more warmth, more attention. He would cry the loudest, fight the hardest. There was something about him, even then, that told Martha he would never accept defeat. Michael was different, weaker, quieter, always seeking comfort. He would calm the moment she rocked him, his tiny fingers gripping whatever part of her he could find. He needed reassurance, safety. Martha feared the world would eat him alive. Grace was unlike either of them. She had large, expressive eyes that seemed too wise for an infant. She rarely cried, instead staring at her surroundings with a strange, silent understanding, as if she knew, even then, that life would not be kind to them. Martha loved them with every piece of her shattered heart. But love wasn't enough to keep death away. It started with the cough. At first, she ignored it. She had been sick before. The nights on the frozen streets had taken their toll over the years, and a cough was nothing new. But then, it worsened. The deep, hacking fits left her breathless, shaking. Blood speckled the rag she held to her mouth. She knew what it meant. She had seen it before. The sickness that claimed so many on the streets. Once it took hold, there was no escaping it. No hospitals would take her. No doctors would waste their time on a dying homeless woman. Still, she kept going. She had to. But as the winter deepened, so did her weakness. Her legs trembled beneath her. Her arms, once strong enough to carry all 3 children at once, now struggled to hold even one. She didn't tell them. They were too young to understand. She still forced a smile when Elijah tugged at her sleeve, his tiny voice demanding food. She still rocked Michael when he whimpered from the cold. She still ran her fingers through Grace's fine hair, murmuring to her even when her throat burned like fire. But deep inside she knew. She wouldn't make it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in hues of deep orange and crimson, she found them a shelter beneath an old, broken-down fire escape. It wasn't much, but it blocked the worst of the wind. She settled against the cold concrete wall, pulling the children close. Her body ached in ways she couldn't describe. Her head was light, her limbs heavy. Elijah, now 6, was the first to notice something was wrong. "Grandma," he murmured, his small hands pressing against her arm. "You're shaking." She forced a smile. "I'm just a little tired, love," she whispered. But the lie wasn't enough. That night, her body gave up. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, Elijah woke up to the sound of her wheezing breaths. His small hands shook her gently. "Grandma!" No response. Michael stirred beside him, rubbing his eyes. Grace remained silent, watching. "Grandma, wake up!" Elijah tried again, his voice rising in panic. Nothing. Then, her breathing stopped. The silence was suffocating. Elijah's breath hitched. He shook her harder. "No, no, no, wake up." Michael began to cry. Grace simply stared wide-eyed, as if she had known this was coming all along. The night swallowed their cries. No one came. No one cared. By morning, Martha Jenkins, the only person who had ever fought for them, was gone. A city worker found her body later that day. A nameless homeless woman, frozen to death. They buried her in an unmarked grave, with no ceremony, no prayers, no one to grieve her except 3 small children, now alone in the world. And just like that, the only warmth they had ever known was gone. The world had never been kind to Elijah, Michael, and Grace, but the day Martha Jenkins died, it became something else entirely. Merciless. There was no one left to protect them. The city workers who found Martha's body barely spared a glance at the 3 children huddled beside her. They didn't ask where they would go or what would happen to them. They simply did their job, hauled the lifeless body away, dumped it in an unmarked grave, and moved on. Elijah screamed for her. He kicked and thrashed, trying to chase after the men who took her. Michael sobbed into his torn sleeves, shaking violently. Grace did not cry. She sat still, her wide, haunted eyes locked on the empty space where Martha had been, as if she knew, even at 6 years old, that their lives had just been swallowed by the same darkness that had taken their grandmother. They waited in that alley for hours. Then, as the last traces of daylight faded into night, the cold crept in, and hunger clawed at their stomachs. They had no choice. They had to survive. Elijah was the first to move. He wiped his face roughly with his sleeve, sniffing hard. "We have to go," he said, his voice hoarse. Michael whimpered. "Where?" Elijah didn't know. But he couldn't let them sit there and die. Taking Grace's hand in one of his and Michael's in the other, he pulled them onto the streets of Detroit, the only home they had ever known. The first night alone. The city felt different without Martha. Before, she had always been there to guide them, to shield them from the worst of the world's cruelty. Now, they felt exposed. 3 small figures in a world that barely noticed their existence. They wandered aimlessly, cold and exhausted, until Elijah spotted a bakery. The smell of freshly baked bread curled through the night air, making their stomachs twist painfully. They pressed their faces against the fogged-up glass window, staring at the golden loaves stacked neatly on the shelves. Michael whimpered. "I'm hungry." Elijah clenched his fists. He had to do something. He pushed open the bakery door cautiously. Warmth flooded over him, a stark contrast to the icy streets outside. Behind the counter stood a burly man with a thick mustache, wiping his hands on a flour-stained apron. Elijah stepped forward. "Please, sir, we just lost our grandma. We don't have anywhere to go. Can you spare something? Just a little." The man barely looked at him. His expression was hard, indifferent. "This isn't a charity, kid. Get out." Elijah's heart sank. Michael, too weak to stand any longer, leaned heavily against him. Grace's small fingers curled around his sleeve. "Please," Elijah tried again, his voice cracking. The man's eyes darkened. "I said get out." Then, before Elijah could react, the man grabbed him by the arm and shoved him out the door. He stumbled onto the pavement, catching himself just before his knees hit the ground. Michael fell with him, letting out a small cry. Elijah's face burned, not from the cold, but from shame, from helplessness. The bakery door slammed shut behind them. Grace knelt beside Michael, helping him up. Elijah sat there for a long moment, breathing hard, fists clenched, the sting of rejection cutting deep. How could people be so cruel? But then, out of nowhere, a voice. "You'll never get anything begging like that, kid." Elijah turned sharply. A hunched old woman in tattered clothes sat a few feet away, watching them from the shadows. Her gray hair was a tangled mess, her face worn and lined. A small, half-eaten piece of bread rested in her lap. Elijah swallowed hard. "Then how?" he asked, his voice shaking. The old woman smirked, taking a slow bite of her bread. "People don't give unless they feel guilty. You gotta be smart. Or fast." She tilted her head toward the bakery. "That guy's got more than he needs. Take it when he ain't looking." Elijah stiffened. Stealing. Martha had always told them never to steal, no matter how hungry they got. It was one of the few lessons she had drilled into them over and over. But Martha was gone, and Elijah was hungry. More importantly, so were Michael and Grace. He turned toward the bakery window again, watching the man behind the counter. He had gone to the back, leaving the bread out in the open. Elijah's pulse pounded in his ears. Michael tugged at his sleeve. "Elijah?" Elijah set his jaw. Martha wouldn't want this. But Martha wasn't here anymore. "I'll be right back," he murmured. Before Michael or Grace could protest, he slipped around the side of the bakery, pressed his small frame against the wall, and crept toward the open delivery door. His hands were sweating despite the cold. His breath came in short, shaky bursts. Then, just as the old woman had said, He moved fast. One loaf. That was all he grabbed. He tucked it under his coat, turned and ran. His heart pounded as he darted through the streets, cutting through alleys, not stopping until he was sure no one was following him. When he finally skidded to a halt, gasping for breath, Michael and Grace were right where he left them. Michael's eyes widened when Elijah pulled the bread from his coat. "You stole that." Elijah hesitated. Then, he tore the loaf in half and handed them each a piece. "Eat," he said. Michael hesitated. But Grace, who had not spoken a single word all night, took a bite. And that was it. The rules had changed. Stealing, lying, running, these were the things that would keep them alive now. And Elijah, just a 6-year-old boy, had already made his choice. The days blurred together into a constant fight for survival. Elijah, Michael, and Grace had no home, no safety, and no one to look after them. They were just 3 small figures lost in the endless streets of Detroit, forced to learn quickly what most children never had to. Hunger became their greatest enemy. It gnawed at their insides, a relentless ache that never truly went away. Some nights they found scraps in dumpsters, stale bread thrown out behind bakeries, or half-eaten sandwiches abandoned on tables at outdoor cafes. Other nights they went to sleep with empty stomachs, curled up in alleyways, clinging to each other for warmth. Elijah took it upon himself to provide. He was the oldest. It was his job now. He became better at stealing, small things at first. A loaf of bread, a piece of fruit, whatever he could slip into his coat without being noticed. It was risky, but it kept them alive. Michael hated it. "Grandma said stealing is wrong," he would whisper, his eyes full of worry. Elijah's jaw would tighten. "Grandma's gone." Grace never said anything. She just watched. Always watching. They learned to navigate the city's hidden places, the abandoned buildings where the homeless gathered, the alleys where they wouldn't be chased away. But nothing lasted forever. The winter was brutal, and with each passing day, Michael grew weaker. His small body couldn't handle the cold the way Elijah and Grace could. His cough, soft at first, became worse, rattling his chest at night as he lay shivering beneath Elijah's coat. His face was pale, his lips cracked. "We have to find help," Grace said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. Elijah knew she was right. But who would help them? They had no family, no money. The city had already proven it didn't care whether they lived or died. Still, he had to try. One rainy afternoon, Elijah made a decision that would change their lives forever. They were sheltering beneath the awning of a rundown gas station, their clothes soaked through, the bitter wind cutting through the wet fabric. Michael was curled against Grace, his breathing shallow. Elijah clenched his fists. He had to do something, anything. Then he saw him. A tall man in a long black coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat, walking slowly down the sidewalk. Something about him made Elijah's stomach twist, a feeling he couldn't name. But the man was dressed well, and that meant money. Elijah hesitated for only a second before making his move. He stepped into the man's path, lifting his small hands in a begging gesture. "Sir, please. My brother is sick. We need food, medicine." The man stopped. He looked down at Elijah, and then he smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was slow, calculated. "You need help, do you?" the man said, his voice deep and smooth. Elijah swallowed hard. Something about this wasn't right. But Michael coughed again, his whole body shaking. Elijah had no choice. "Yes," he said. The man's smile widened. "I can help you," he said. But nothing in this world is free, boy. If you want something, you have to be willing to give something in return. Elijah's breath caught. Grace stiffened beside him. The man's gaze slid past Elijah, to Michael. "That one's weak," the man murmured, almost to himself. "Won't last long on the streets. But I could take him somewhere warm, somewhere safe. He'd get food, medicine, a real bed to sleep in." Elijah felt sick. Michael was his brother. But what if the man was telling the truth? What if Michael would be better off somewhere else? Elijah turned to look at him, his little brother trembling, so small beneath the weight of hunger and cold. Then, before Elijah could speak, before he could decide, Michael took a step forward. "I'll go," he whispered. Grace gasped. Elijah's blood ran cold. "Michael, no." But Michael turned to him, his face tired, resigned. "I can't keep doing this," he said. His voice was weak, barely audible. "I don't want to die out here, Elijah." The man reached out. Michael hesitated, then placed his small hand in the man's. Elijah felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. Michael was choosing to leave, and Elijah was letting him. The man squeezed Michael's shoulder, then turned away, guiding him down the street. Elijah couldn't move. He wanted to run after him, to grab him, stop him, scream at him not to go. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching, until Michael disappeared into the rain. Grace didn't speak for a long time after that. They sat in silence, watching the empty street where their brother had once stood. "You let him go," Grace finally whispered. Elijah's chest ached. He wanted to go. Grace turned away from him. Elijah clenched his fists. He told himself Michael was better off, that he was safe, warm, fed. But deep down he knew something was wrong, and he had just lost his little brother forever. The rain poured endlessly, washing away the footprints Michael had left behind as he disappeared into the unknown. The sound of it filled the empty space where his voice had once been, but it did nothing to drown out the guilt weighing on Elijah's chest. He had let him go. Even though Michael had made the choice, even though the man had promised warmth and food, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had just happened. A part of him wanted to run after his brother, to drag him back, to fight whoever tried to take him away. But the other part, the part that had learned, far too young, that the world didn't work that way, knew it was too late. Michael was gone. Grace hadn't spoken since it happened. She sat beside Elijah under the gas station awning, her small frame curled in on itself, arms wrapped tightly around her thin body. The silence between them was suffocating. Finally, Elijah forced himself to stand. "We need to go," he said, his voice hollow. Grace didn't move. "We can't stay here," he tried again. "Come on, Gracie." At the sound of her name, she lifted her head slightly, but her expression was blank. For the first time since they had lost Martha, Elijah saw something in her eyes that scared him. She looked like she had given up. Panic clawed at his chest. He could lose one person, not two. He reached for her hand. "We have to keep moving. We have to survive." Grace didn't resist as he pulled her up, but she didn't help either. It was as if her body was moving without her mind. Elijah tightened his grip. He wouldn't lose her. They wandered for hours, the rain never letting up, their soaked clothes clinging to their frozen skin. By nightfall, they found shelter in an old, abandoned car behind a liquor store. The back seat smelled like mildew, but at least it was dry. Elijah let Grace lie down first, then sat beside her, his mind racing. He needed a plan. They couldn't keep living like this. Michael had been the weakest, but they weren't much better off. If they didn't find something soon, food, warmth, safety, they would die just like Martha. The thought sent a shiver through his body, colder than the rain ever could. In the silence, Grace finally spoke. "Do you think he's okay?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her that Michael was warm, that he was eating something soft and sweet, that he was finally safe. But the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't trust that man. He didn't trust the world. He sighed, staring at the cracked windshield in front of them. "I hope so," he finally said. Grace didn't say anything else. She just turned onto her side, curling into herself, and closed her eyes. Elijah didn't sleep that night. Somewhere in the city, Michael was alone. Somewhere in the darkness, he was either safe, or in something worse than death. And Elijah had no way to find him. The next few weeks were a blur of hunger, cold, and survival. Elijah did whatever he had to do to keep himself and Grace alive. He stole from street vendors, snatched forgotten change from counters, and took food from any place that left it unguarded. At first, Grace followed him everywhere. She was silent, always watching, always thinking, but at least she was there. Then, one morning, she was gone. Elijah woke up in the back seat of the abandoned car to find her side empty. His heart nearly stopped. He scrambled out onto the street, scanning the alley, the sidewalk, the buildings. Nothing. "Grace!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from sleep and panic. No answer. He ran. He searched every place they had been before, asked every homeless person he had ever seen, ran down every alley, turned every corner. But she was gone. It was as if the city had swallowed her whole. He didn't stop looking for days. Even when his stomach screamed for food, even when exhaustion made his legs weak, even when the cold seeped into his bones, he searched. But she had vanished. First Michael, now Grace. Elijah had nothing left. The first time he ever fought someone for food was the night after he lost her. He had tried to steal a loaf of bread from a small market, but this time he wasn't fast enough. A man caught his wrist, twisting it painfully. "You little thief," the man spat. Elijah fought. He kicked, bit, clawed. He fought like a wild animal. He lost. The man slammed him into the pavement, knocking the breath from his lungs. Someone called the police, and before Elijah could escape, hands gripped his arms, dragging him up. He screamed, thrashed, but they were stronger. Within hours, he was processed, locked away in a juvenile detention center. The world had won, and Elijah had lost everything. If you're enjoying this story, leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our content. Detroit had changed, but its shadows remained the same. The alleys still whispered with secrets, the cold still crept through the cracks of forgotten buildings, and the people still moved past suffering as if it were just another part of the city's architecture. Grace had learned long ago how to navigate this world. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the wet pavement as she made her way down a dimly lit street in the heart of the city. The neon lights from a nearby bar cast a flickering glow against the puddles, distorting her reflection. She barely glanced at it. There was no time for sentimentality. She had spent years searching, years chasing ghosts, piecing together fragments of a past that had been ripped apart by poverty and cruelty. Every lead had been a dead end. Every name she tracked down had been the wrong one. Until now. In her coat pocket, she clutched a crumpled piece of paper. A name. A location. Elijah. She had finally found him. Her fingers tightened around the note as she approached the entrance of the bar. From the outside, it looked like any other rundown dive in the city. Faded signage, bouncers who didn't ask questions, a door that had been reinforced too many times to count. But inside, she knew it was a different world. The kind of place where dangerous men gathered. The kind of place where people like Elijah survived. She pushed open the door. The smell of stale alcohol and cigarette smoke hit her instantly. Laughter, loud and coarse, filled the air, along with the clinking of glasses and the heavy beat of music from an old jukebox in the corner. She scanned the room. Then, she saw him. He was sitting in the back, alone, a half-empty glass in front of him. Elijah was no longer the boy she remembered. He was broad-shouldered, his frame hardened by years of survival. His face, once full of fire, was now unreadable, his sharp features shadowed by the dim lighting. His knuckles were scarred, his jacket worn, his posture relaxed, but there was tension in his stillness, like a man who had spent his whole life ready to fight. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. It had been more than 2 decades since she had last seen him. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what she would say, how he would react. But now that she was here, standing just feet away, the words wouldn't come. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. As she approached, Elijah's eyes flicked up, meeting hers. For a moment, there was nothing. No recognition. No shock. Just silence. Then, his lips curved into a slow, humorless smirk. "Well," he said, his voice rough and edged with something unreadable. "Look who finally found me." Grace's throat tightened. "You remember me," she whispered. Elijah leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Of course I remember you," he said, tilting his glass slightly. "You're the one who disappeared." The accusation in his tone was sharp, unexpected. Grace swallowed hard. "I didn't disappear, Elijah. I was taken." Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone too fast for her to read. He exhaled slowly, swirling the liquor in his glass before downing the rest of it in one quick motion. "Doesn't matter," he muttered, setting the glass down. "What do you want, Grace?" She hesitated. She had played this conversation out so many times in her mind, but none of her imagined scenarios had prepared her for this. For how distant he felt. For how much he had changed. "I've been looking for you for years," she said, her voice softer now. "I had to find you. I had to know if you were alive." Elijah let out a short, dry chuckle. "Well," he said, gesturing vaguely to himself, "here I am. Alive. Congratulations." Grace flinched at his tone. "I know what happened to you," she continued, trying to break through the wall between them. "The reformatory, the fights, the arrests. I know what they did to you in there." Elijah's jaw tightened, but his expression remained unreadable. "You don't know a damn thing, Grace," he said quietly. She took another step closer. "I know you've been surviving," she said. "I know this place, this life. None of it is who you really are." He laughed again, but there was no warmth in it. "Who I really am," he echoed, shaking his head. "You don't know who I am." "I know you're my brother," she said firmly. "And I know we're not finished yet." Elijah's gaze darkened. "Finished," he repeated. She pulled a folded photograph from her coat pocket and slid it across the table. Elijah hesitated before picking it up. The second he saw what it was, the smirk vanished from his face. A picture of Michael. Older, thinner, his eyes hollow, his face lined with years of suffering. Elijah's fingers tightened around the edges of the photo. His breathing slowed. "He's alive," Grace said softly. Elijah didn't speak. Grace leaned in. "I'm going to find him," she said. "With or without you." Elijah's grip on the photograph trembled slightly, but his face remained cold, unreadable. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, finally, Elijah looked up, meeting her gaze with something fierce and unreadable in his eyes. "When do we start?" The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of decades pressing down on the small table between them. Elijah held the photograph in his calloused fingers, staring at the image of their lost brother. His face remained unreadable, but Grace knew better. She saw the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers curled tightly around the edges of the paper, the way his chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. She had struck something deep. "I need to know if you're in this with me," she said, her voice steady but soft. Elijah exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He placed the photograph down on the table and slid it back toward her. "You think you can just show up after 25 years and drag me into whatever this is?" His voice was low, edged with something dangerous. "You think I've just been waiting for you to walk in and give me a purpose again?" Grace met his stare. "I think you care more than you want to admit." Elijah's expression darkened. "You have no idea who I am anymore, Grace." "Then tell me." His fingers drummed against the table, a slow, rhythmic tap against the wood. His eyes burned into hers, filled with something unreadable, resentment, pain, maybe even regret. "Do you know what happened after you disappeared?" he asked finally, his voice dangerously quiet. Grace swallowed hard. "I know you ended up in a reformatory." Elijah let out a dry, humorless laugh. "A reformatory," he repeated. "That's a polite way of putting it." He leaned forward, his voice lower now. "I was 6 years old, Grace. 6. The first night, they threw me in a cell with boys twice my size. You think the streets were bad? That place made the streets look like a damn fairy tale." Grace's stomach twisted. She had spent years researching, digging into records, reading the stories of the boys who had survived places like that. She had known it was bad. But hearing Elijah say it, seeing the shadow in his eyes, made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "I fought every day," Elijah continued, his voice tight. "At first, I fought to survive. Then, I fought because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. They beat the softness out of me, Grace. They turned me into someone who knew how to take a punch and give one twice as hard." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. "Elijah!" He ignored her. "You want to know who I am now?" He gestured around the bar. "This is who I am. I don't play hero. I don't chase ghosts." Grace's chest tightened. "Michael isn't a ghost," she said. "He's alive, Elijah, and we need to get him back." Elijah scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "And what makes you think he even wants to be found?" Grace flinched. It was the same question that had haunted her since the moment she started searching. She had imagined 100 different scenarios. Michael lost, Michael trapped, Michael waiting for them. But she had never let herself consider the possibility that he might not want them anymore. She straightened her shoulders. "I don't care. He's our brother." Elijah stared at her for a long moment. Then he smirked. "Family is for the weak." The words cut deeper than Grace expected. She felt the sting of them, felt the way they chipped away at the image of the brother she had once known. But she didn't let it show. She leaned in. "You don't believe that?" Elijah didn't respond. Grace sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't know what they did to you, Elijah. I don't know what you had to do to survive. But I know this. Whatever version of you they created in that place, it's not the real you. It never was." Elijah's smirk faded. Something flickered in his expression. Something raw, something vulnerable, something real. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He picked up his glass, downed the rest of his drink, and exhaled slowly. "What's the plan?" he muttered. Grace blinked. "What?" "You heard me," Elijah said, setting the glass down with a soft clink. "If we're doing this, we do it my way. No stupid risks. No blind hope." Grace stared at him for a moment, searching his face, trying to understand what had just changed in him. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said. Elijah pushed himself up from the chair, grabbing his leather jacket off the back of it. "Then let's go get our brother." Grace released a shaky breath. For the first time in 25 years, she wasn't alone anymore. The streets of Detroit blurred past them as Grace drove, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Elijah sat beside her, silent, staring out the window with an expression that was unreadable. He hadn't asked where she had gotten the car, and she hadn't offered an explanation. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was Michael. The information she had gathered led them to an old warehouse near the edge of the city, an area known for things that happened in the dark, things the police ignored, things people pretended didn't exist. Elijah cracked his knuckles absently, a habit that Grace recognized from childhood. But the boy she had known had disappeared long ago. The man beside her now was something else entirely. "Tell me everything," he said finally, his voice low. Grace inhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. "I found a lead a few weeks ago. A man, an ex-runner for a trafficking ring. He had information about Michael, but was too scared to talk at first." Elijah turned his head toward her. "How'd you get him to talk?" She hesitated. Elijah's lips curled into a smirk. "Didn't think you had it in you, Gracie." She shot him a quick glare before continuing. "He told me about a network, people who take kids off the streets and sell them. Some of them get sent overseas, some are used here. The ones that aren't worth much," she trailed off, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Elijah didn't press her to finish. He understood. "Michael wasn't sent away," she said, keeping her voice steady. "He was kept here. He was passed around, moved from one place to another. And now, he's in that warehouse." Elijah let out a slow breath, processing everything. Grace glanced at him. "Say something." Elijah rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck. "How many men are inside?" She exhaled, relieved that he wasn't shutting down. "From what I was told, 5 or 6. Maybe more." Elijah nodded. "Armed?" "Most likely." "Security cameras?" "I don't know. But it doesn't matter." Elijah turned to her, his brow raising slightly. She met his eyes. "We're getting him out." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Damn right we are." The warehouse came into view, a large, rusted structure that had once been part of an old shipping yard. It looked abandoned, but Grace knew better. The people who operated in places like this thrived on invisibility. No one would suspect what happened behind those doors. She pulled the car to a stop a few blocks away. Elijah was already reaching into the back seat, checking the small duffel bag she had brought. A gun, a knife, and a pair of bolt cutters. He let out a low chuckle. "Didn't think you'd come this prepared." Grace ignored him, stepping out of the car. The wind was sharp, biting through her coat as they moved toward the warehouse. Elijah kept a step ahead of her, his posture loose but alert, the way a predator moves before striking. He had changed, but Grace could still see the brother she once knew beneath the hardened edges. When they reached the side of the building, they pressed themselves against the cold metal wall. Elijah nodded toward her. "Stay close," she scoffed. That was the plan. They crept along the perimeter, listening. The wind howled through the broken windows above them, but underneath it, there were voices, muffled low. Elijah moved first, slipping toward the back entrance. He tested the handle. Locked. Grace pulled the bolt cutters from the bag. Elijah took them without a word and made quick work of the rusted chain securing the door. With one final glance toward her, he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and the lingering scent of cigarette smoke. The dim yellow lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the walls. Footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. Elijah moved swiftly, his footsteps silent. Grace followed, keeping close. Then they heard it. A voice. Weak. Raspy. "Michael." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She turned her head sharply, scanning the space until she spotted a metal cage against the far wall. A figure sat inside, barely moving. Her stomach twisted violently. Michael was slumped against the bars, his body too thin, his skin bruised. His wrists were cuffed in front of him, a heavy chain securing him to the cage. His once bright eyes were dull, his face hollow. He looked nothing like the boy she had lost. "Michael," she whispered. His head lifted slightly, and then recognition. "Gracie." His voice was barely more than a breath. Something in her broke. Elijah didn't hesitate. He pulled the knife from his belt and strode toward the cage. But before he could reach him, a voice rang out. "Hey!" Elijah spun just as a man emerged from the shadows, reaching for the gun at his waist. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. Elijah moved fast. Before the man could react, Elijah closed the distance, slamming his fist into the guy's throat. The man choked, staggering backward, but Elijah was relentless. He grabbed him by the collar and drove his knee into his stomach. The man crumpled to the ground, gasping. Grace grabbed his gun before he could recover. Elijah turned back to the cage, breathing heavily. "We need to move. Now." Grace rushed to Michael's side, gripping the bars. "We're getting you out of here," she whispered. Michael's eyes filled with something she hadn't seen in years. Hope. Elijah jammed the knife into the lock, twisting until it gave way. The door swung open with a metallic creak. Michael was too weak to stand. Without hesitation, Elijah crouched and lifted him into his arms. Grace wiped at the tears stinging her eyes and turned toward the exit. Footsteps. More of them. Elijah shifted Michael's weight against his chest. Time to go. They ran. Through the dark corridors, past the unconscious man, through the same back door they had come in. The cold night air hit them like a wave. Grace pulled the car door open, and Elijah climbed into the back seat with Michael. She jumped into the driver's seat, slamming her foot on the gas as tires screeched against the pavement. The warehouse disappeared behind them. Michael let out a shaky breath, his head resting against Elijah's shoulder. "You found me," he murmured. Elijah looked down at him, his face unreadable. "We're not losing you again," he said. Grace's hands trembled on the steering wheel. For the first time in decades, they were together, and no one was taking them apart again. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the dim glow of streetlights casting flickering shadows across the car's interior. The city blurred into darkness behind them, fading like a bad dream. The only sounds were the low hum of the engine and Michael's uneven breathing as he lay against Elijah in the back seat. Grace kept her hands steady on the wheel, but her mind was racing. Michael was safe. He was alive. But the damage had already been done. She stole a glance at the rearview mirror. Michael's body was frail, too thin, his wrists marked by bruises where the cuffs had been. His eyes were sunken, haunted. He wasn't the little boy they had lost. He was a man who had survived hell. And Elijah. Elijah held Michael carefully, but his expression was like stone. His jaw was tight, his gaze locked on nothing. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in whatever thoughts he refused to share. Grace exhaled slowly. None of them were the same anymore. She tightened her grip on the wheel. It didn't matter. They had him now. They had each other. That had to be enough. After an hour of driving, she pulled into the parking lot of a run-down motel just outside the city. The neon sign buzzed weakly above them, the paint peeling off the walls. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Elijah carefully eased Michael out of the car, one arm wrapped around his brother's shoulders to support his weight. Michael barely had the strength to stand. Grace hurried ahead, paying for a room in cash. The man behind the counter barely looked up, tossing her the key without a word. They made their way inside, the small room dimly lit and stale with the scent of cigarette smoke. The bed was stiff, the furniture old, but it didn't matter. It was warm. Elijah lowered Michael onto the bed, careful, as if afraid he might break. Grace grabbed a towel from the bathroom, soaking it in warm water before kneeling beside Michael and pressing it gently against his face. He flinched at first, but then, after a moment, he leaned into the touch. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "You really found me." Grace smiled, though her throat was tight. "I told you I would." Michael's gaze flickered toward Elijah. Elijah met his eyes, silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain tapping against the window. Then, Elijah finally spoke, his voice low. "You look like hell." Michael let out a weak chuckle. "You're one to talk." Something in Elijah's face softened, just slightly. Michael's smile faded. His hands trembled as he picked at the loose thread of the motel blanket, his voice quieter now. I thought you forgot about me." Elijah's whole body tensed. He looked away, rubbing his hands over his face before finally exhaling. "Not for a second." Michael swallowed hard. His eyes were glassy, too many emotions swirling in them at once. Relief, pain, disbelief. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Being normal. Being free." Grace reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Then we'll figure it out together." Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His face was unreadable again, but his voice was steady. "You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore," he said. "No one's coming for you. They'd have to go through me first." Michael let out a shaky breath. For the first time in decades, he wasn't alone. The three of them sat there in silence, the weight of the years between them settling in. They weren't kids anymore. They had been broken, scattered, lost. But now, they were found. Days passed, and Michael slowly began to heal. He slept for long stretches at a time, his body trying to recover from years of exhaustion. Grace made sure he ate, even when he said he wasn't hungry. Elijah barely left the room, always keeping an eye on the door, his instincts refusing to let him relax completely. But for the first time in years, they weren't just surviving. They were living. And it wasn't enough just to escape the past. They had to build something new. One evening, as the sun set outside the motel window, Grace turned to her brothers. "We need to do something," she said. Elijah raised a brow. "We just risked our lives getting him back. I think we've done enough for a while." Grace shook her head. Not just for us. For the kids out there, the ones still on the streets, the ones still trapped. We can't be the only ones who went through this. Elijah sighed, leaning back in his chair. So, what? You want to start a rescue mission? No, Grace said firmly. I want to build a place where kids like us don't have to suffer. Somewhere safe. Somewhere they can get food, shelter, and a chance to have a future. Michael sat up slightly, watching her carefully. She met his gaze. Somewhere like Martha would have wanted. A long silence stretched between them. Elijah exhaled, rubbing his jaw. That's a hell of a dream, Gracie. Grace smirked. Well, we never really had normal dreams, did we? Michael, for the first time in years, smiled. 2 years later, Hope Diner opened its doors. It wasn't just a restaurant. It was a refuge. A place where kids who had nowhere else to go could get a hot meal, a place to rest, and most importantly, a chance to be seen. Elijah ran the kitchen, his sharp instincts and quick hands now used for chopping vegetables instead of fights. Grace handled the logistics, securing donations, organizing resources, making sure no child was turned away. Michael spent his time with the kids, sitting with them, listening, making sure they knew they weren't forgotten. Word spread quickly. People came. Not just the hungry, but those who wanted to help. And for the first time, the three of them were no longer just survivors. They were something more. One evening, as the three of them stood outside the diner, watching the sun dip below the city skyline, Michael let out a slow breath. She would have loved this, he murmured. Grace nodded, her eyes stinging. Yeah, she would. Elijah crossed his arms, looking up at the sky. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, with a quiet voice, he muttered, "Thanks, Grandma." Grace swallowed hard, and Michael let out a small laugh, shaking his head. Elijah smirked. And for the first time in years, they weren't just survivors. They were home. And if you liked this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications. See you next time.